This door was never meant to be opened. If you think old Irish castles have already told you everything they have to tell, you're wrong. In 1814, a routine renovation of a centuries-old Irish castle suddenly turned into a genuine historical investigation. In a rarely used corridor, workers noticed a doorway, packed solid with junk. Why would anyone go to such lengths to make sure no one ever reached that door? When they finally cleared the debris, they were looking at a legacy more than 900 years old. One of the objects they found was covered in gold, silver, tangled interlacing, and creatures with glass eyes. And a surviving inscription named people who had lived at the start of the 12th century. Who hid this extraordinary relic? What threat were they trying to save it from? Why did no one ever come back for it? And was finding it really just an accident? This isn't just about one forgotten corridor. It's about an entire system of church power that someone tried to hide from both prying eyes and time itself. Today, I'm going to show you a craftsman's signature, carved into metal 900 years ago. A reliquary hidden inside the head of a crozier, and an inscription that names a man who died in 1113. We're going to work out why an ordinary-looking church staff was actually a formidable mark of power. Stay to the end. After this video, you won't be able to walk past a locked door in an old building again without asking yourself, what did they wall up in there? Lismore was never just another monastery on the map of medieval Ireland. It was considered one of the country's leading religious centers, and in the south of the island, it had practically no rivals. Manuscripts were kept here, clergy were trained here, and the influence concentrated here was something even secular rulers had to reckon with. So an ancient church relic turning up at Lismore is no accident. But where exactly it turned up raises far more questions. It was on these very grounds that the famous Abbey of Lismore once stood. Later, the monastic lands passed to new owners, and a castle rose above the old religious center. Eras changed, owners changed, political orders changed, but the walls kept hiding traces of a past that no one remembered anymore. In 1811, Lismore Castle passed to the 6th Duke of Devonshire. He inherited it after the death of his father, the 5th Duke, and the new owner almost immediately launched a massive renovation. An ordinary rebuild of an aristocratic residence unexpectedly turned into a historical investigation. Just 3 years later, in 1814, workers reached a rarely used part of the castle. That's where the story of a discovery that can't be explained as a simple loss began. Someone, at some point, sealed off part of a corridor, left ancient treasures behind that barrier, and then let the memory of that place vanish completely. The renovation was proceeding as usual, until, in that rarely used corridor, workers noticed a strange doorway. It was so densely packed with old furniture, debris, and worthless clutter that it looked more like a section of wall than a door. It seemed like someone had deliberately made sure no one would ever approach it. But was this an ordinary storeroom, or a carefully forgotten hiding place? The workers began clearing the junk piece by piece. Behind the pile, a door gradually emerged, one that clearly hadn't been used in years. When the passage was finally cleared and opened, what lay behind it wasn't a utility room. It was two objects capable of rewriting the history of Lismore itself. The first was a richly decorated bishop's crosier, dating back to the start of the 12th century. Beside it lay an ancient manuscript, later named the Book of Lismore. Its pages recorded tales of Irish saints, written in early medieval Gaelic. This wasn't some book left behind by accident. The manuscript was found inside a wooden box, built specifically to protect it, which means whoever put it behind that door understood exactly what it was worth. The crozier and the book weren't tossed away among discarded junk. They were hidden together, and someone had gone out of their way to preserve them. The find looked far too deliberate to be a simple loss. Two of the most important surviving witnesses to Lismore's monastic past ended up in one sealed space, cut off from the rest of the castle. Who built this hiding place? What threat they feared? And why no one ever came back for the treasures? The documents give no direct answer. Once the hiding place was opened, one thing became clear. This wasn't an ordinary wooden staff with a bit of metal trim. The Lismore Crozier was a complex construction, combining the work of a carver, a founder, and a jeweler. For the early 12th century, this was an object of exceptional value, the kind only an influential church patron could commission. The core was carved from solid oak. The wood was sheathed in plates of copper alloy, over which decorative silver and gold elements were fixed in place. Glass inlays and niello, a dark compound craftsman used to sharpen the lines of an ornament and set it in stark contrast against gleaming metal, completed the composition. This wasn't decoration bolted onto an already finished stick. Every plate had to fit the wooden core with precision, and the silver, gold, and glass details had to form a single, unified composition. One mistake at any stage could ruin expensive metal and the entire commission. A medieval craftsman wasn't making a household object here. He was building a genuine symbol of power, designed to be noticed from a distance. The upper curved section of the crozier was especially intricate. It was cast from a single piece of bronze, yet left hollow inside. That choice reduced the weight of the whole construction, while preserving both its strength and its imposing appearance. But inside that curve was hidden another detail, the one that turned a ceremonial staff into a genuine religious treasure. Set into the base of the crozier's head was a small reliquary, a separate compartment for a venerated relic. What exactly was kept inside it 9 centuries ago? The sources don't say. But its very presence changes the meaning of the object. The bishop wasn't just holding a badge of office in his hand. He was carrying a portable, sacred vessel. The real sensation wasn't hiding in the gold or the glass inlays. On the base of the crozier survived an inscription, one that turned an anonymous antique into a document with named participants. While the origins of most medieval relics rest on guesswork, the Lismore Crozier essentially names its own creators. The inscription states that the crozier was made by a craftsman named Nechtain. 9 centuries ago, he left on his work what today we'd call a personal signature. His name outlived wars, religious upheaval, the disappearance of the abbey, and centuries of the artifact itself being forgotten. Here's a rare case where we know not just the craftsman, but the patron. The work was commissioned by Niall Mac Mic Aeducain, Bishop of Lismore and one of the most influential church figures of his time. So this crozier wasn't made as anonymous decoration. It was made to the direct order of the head of one of Southern Ireland's most important monastic centers. One short inscription handed researchers 3 keys at once: place, patron, and craftsman. It tied the object to Lismore and let historians pin down its origins far more precisely than is possible for most comparable relics. What we're looking at is, quite literally, a signature from the start of the 12th century that neither time nor people managed to erase. The inscription on the crozier let researchers narrow down when it was made to the period when Lismore was governed by Bishop Niall Mac Mic Aeducain. He most likely commissioned this lavish symbol of spiritual power for his own abbey. Back then, the monastery occupied the very ground on which Lismore Castle would later rise. We're talking about the start of the 12th century, when Lismore still held its place as one of Ireland's most important religious centers. A crozier like this wasn't made in advance and sold off to whoever happened to want one. It was made for a specific owner, tailored to his rank, his authority, and his connection to a specific church community. One date matters more than any other: 1113. That's the year Bishop Niall Mac Mic Aeducain died. So the crozier he commissioned must have been made before that date, during his own tenure at Lismore. But a clear line needs to be drawn here. Researchers didn't get an exact year of manufacture, they got an upper limit. The inscription proves the artifact's connection to the bishop, and 1113 proves the crozier is already more than 900 years old. So a few words carved into metal tied an object found behind a sealed door to a specific person, a specific monastery, and a specific historical period. Without that inscription, the crozier would have to be dated mainly by its ornamentation and its construction technique. With it, the crozier became a rare document, arriving from medieval Lismore almost without an intermediary. Look closely at the crozier, and a stern symbol of episcopal authority turns into a genuine menagerie. Its surface is covered in coiled lines, dense interlace, and figures of fantastical animals. Some of these creatures look like they're breaking free of the metal, jaws open, glass eyes glinting. The craftsman barely left a single visible surface untouched. Patterns catch on each other, split apart, and reconnect, creating a constant sense of movement. Gold and silver caught the light. Dark niello sharpened the outlines, and colored glass made the metal beast's eyes look almost alive. This is the artistic tradition of medieval Ireland, where Christian symbols merged with older ornament and animal imagery. You can see similar interlace on the famous Tara brooch and on the richly decorated reliquaries built for church bells. The Lismore Crozier didn't copy these objects, but it clearly belonged to the same artistic world. The heads of the creatures, jaws thrown open, look especially defiant. They didn't just decorate the curved section of the crozier. They turned a church regalia into an object full of hidden motion and tension. Why cover the symbol of a Christian bishop in imagery that looks like predators and monsters? The answer lies in the language of medieval art. Animals like these didn't necessarily represent evil. They could just as easily symbolize strength, protection, trial, or power over chaos. To a modern viewer, this reads as elaborate ornament. To a person in the 12th century, every jaw, every spiral, every line could carry a clear religious meaning. 9 centuries didn't pass over the Lismore Crozier without leaving a mark. Some of the intricate filigree panels were lost. Some decorative elements disappeared. The metal surface carries the inevitable scars of time. And yet, the artifact reached us in a condition that's hard to call anything but astonishing. The main oak structure survived. So did the metal plates, fragments of the gold and silver decoration, the niello, the glass inlays, and the distinctive animal figures. Even after centuries of being forgotten, researchers were able to study the craftsman's technique and reconstruct the original design. This is an object made at the start of the 12th century that survived a succession of owners, the disappearance of the monastery, and the reshaping of the entire site. The crozier didn't spend that whole time in a museum case, held at constant temperature, protected from damp. It spent a significant part of its history in unknown conditions, before ending up behind a sealed door in a castle. What's especially remarkable is that the inscription naming the craftsman and the patron survived. You could lose a single gold plate and still understand what the object once looked like. But if those few lines on the base had vanished, the Lismore Crozier would have lost its single most important historical feature and turned into just another poorly dated relic. It didn't reach us intact, but it kept exactly what turned out to matter more than lost splendor: its structure, its recognizable decoration, and its own biography. For an object more than 900 years old, that's not just good preservation, it's almost a defiance of time itself. The Lismore Crozier was never a luxury walking stick, and it was never a harmless decoration for a church ceremony. In a bishop's hands, it became a public statement. Standing before you is a man granted the right to lead a community, to control church holdings, and to speak in the name of a powerful monastic center. Gold, silver, and elaborate ornament here worked for power just as effectively as any seal or crown. The very curve of the crozier echoed a shepherd's crook. The meaning was clear to everyone. The bishop was the shepherd, and the faithful were his flock. But behind that peaceful religious image sat a very earthly kind of power, since large monasteries owned land, accumulated wealth, and played an active role in Ireland's political life. We're talking about an era when spiritual and secular power constantly overlapped. A bishop's authority wasn't defined only by his rank within the church, but by his monastery's influence, his ties to rulers, and his control over valuable relics. The richer his crozier looked, the more clearly everyone around him understood his status. The Lismore Crozier was made after several centuries of Viking raids and Scandinavian settlement across Ireland. Old centers of power were shifting. Monasteries were being plundered. New towns and trade networks were expanding Norse influence. In these conditions, church regalia stopped being just ceremonial objects. They became visible proof of the old order's stability and legitimacy. But an even bigger shock was on its way. In 1169, the Anglo-Norman invasion began, followed by the gradual establishment of the newcomers' power across much of the island. A crozier made for the Bishop of Lismore decades earlier had now become a witness to an era when Ireland's political map was about to change all over again. Remember that date. We'll come back to it when we try to work out exactly what the crozier was being hidden from. So the value of this artifact was never just about expensive materials. It signaled who held spiritual leadership, whose monastery still commanded influence, and whose authority was to be treated as legitimate. Behind the gleam of gold sat a warning that people of the Middle Ages understood without a single word being spoken. And this is exactly where the story brings us back to that sealed door in the castle. An object of this caliber could never simply have been forgotten in a corridor or accidentally left among old furniture. It represented the authority of Lismore Abbey. It contained a reliquary. And it was made from materials that, on their own, held enormous value. The most obvious theory goes like this. The crozier was hidden on purpose. During periods of religious conflict, church treasures could be confiscated, melted down, sold off, or destroyed as symbols of the old faith. Whoever was responsible for the relic's safety may have had only one option left: put it somewhere no one would ever think to look. This isn't a proven event, it's a historical hypothesis. No order to hide the Lismore Crozier has ever been found. The identity of whoever built the hiding place is unknown, and the exact time of the concealment can't be pinned down. But the location of the find speaks for itself. The crozier wasn't sitting in an open room. It was behind a door that had been deliberately sealed off. What's especially telling is that the Book of Lismore was right there beside it, protected inside a wooden box. Two of the monastery's most valuable relics ended up together, as if someone was trying to save them both from the exact same threat. If that's a coincidence, it's a remarkably convenient one. And if the hiding place was built deliberately, then whoever built it expected to come back one day. But the theory of deliberate rescue demands a closer look at exactly who might have posed that threat. Who was one of Lismore's greatest treasures being hidden from? From looters? From new landowners? From religious opponents? Or from people who wouldn't have hesitated to melt down an ancient regalia for its precious metal? Later periods of religious upheaval in Ireland repeatedly put older monastic treasures at risk. Objects that had spent centuries confirming an abbey's authority could, in a single moment, turn into dangerous liabilities. They were confiscated, sold off, broken apart, or destroyed as symbols of a rejected church tradition. For whoever was guarding the Lismore Crozier, a hiding place may have been the only way to save it. The presence of the Book of Lismore right beside it looks especially suspicious. This wasn't some random manuscript someone left behind after reading it. It was a collection of stories about Irish saints written in early medieval Gaelic. The book was placed inside a wooden box, meaning someone had already taken steps to protect it. The crozier and the manuscript ended up together behind the same door, as if an unknown guardian had gathered together everything that most needed saving. But there's no direct proof of any of this. No order to hide anything has been found. No name survives for whoever sealed that door. And no one knows exactly which year the hiding place was created. History has left us only the end result. Two of the monastery's most important objects sitting in an isolated space behind a passage that was walled up and, over time, practically erased from memory. This is where documented history ends and careful investigation begins. We can say with confidence that the objects were found together in 1814. We can confirm that the book was protected inside a wooden box and that the doorway was concealed under debris. But claiming the hiding place was built during a specific period, or to save the objects from specific people, isn't something we can do without more sources. And yet the theory of deliberate rescue explains a great deal. If the crozier had simply been lost, it's unlikely it would have ended up right next to an ancient manuscript. If the objects had been thrown out as worthless junk, no one would have bothered putting the book in a protective box. And if someone had been planning to sell them, the treasures wouldn't have stayed behind a locked door for generations. The hiding place was probably meant to be temporary. The crozier and the book may have been hidden for a matter of days or weeks, just until the danger passed. Whoever hid them likely expected to come back, open the door, and hand the relics back to the monastery. But something disrupted that plan. The person left Lismore, lost access to the castle, or never got the chance to tell anyone else the hiding place existed. Then began the most reliable protection of all, being forgotten. Owners came and went, rooms were rebuilt. The old corridor's original purpose was lost, and the sealed door slowly vanished behind an accumulation of junk. New owners may not have had the faintest idea that behind it sat a piece of Ireland's monastic history. So, an attempt to save a sacred object may have turned into centuries of disappearance. The Lismore Crozier survived, not despite being forgotten, but precisely because of it. But the real question is still open. Who was it hidden from? And what was happening at Lismore in that final moment when the ancient door closed for the last time? The history of Irish treasures isn't fair. Some objects become national symbols, printed on posters, book covers, and textbook pages. Others, no less complex or significant, spend years living in the shadow of a more famous neighbor. Here's a good example. Two famous Irish chalices. The Derrynaflin chalice is often called a scaled-down cousin of the Ardagh chalice, even though it's a masterpiece in its own right, with its own construction, its own ornament, and its own story of discovery. A simple comparison helps a viewer quickly picture what the object looks like, but it also strips it of its own name. Something similar happened to the Lismore Crozier. It's constantly compared to the Clonmacnoise Crozier, as if one of them has to be the main event, and the other just a lesser-known copy. But that judgment is too convenient and far too shallow. These are two medieval Irish regalia that genuinely do share a striking resemblance. Both objects represent church authority. Both are covered in elaborate metal overlay, interlace, and animal figures. At first glance, it looks like we're looking at two versions of the same artistic idea. But resemblance doesn't mean one is derivative of the other. Medieval craftsmen worked within a shared artistic tradition, used familiar symbols, and passed their techniques down to the next generation. Which means the same motifs could appear at different monastic centers without one object ever directly copying another. The Lismore Crozier has an advantage that can't be ignored. It carries an inscription naming both the craftsman and the patron. We know it was made by Nechtain for Bishop Niall Mac Mic Aeducain. Thanks to that inscription, the artifact is tied to a specific person, a specific place, and a period no later than 1113. The Clonmacnoise Crozier deserves no less attention, but its history and its body of evidence are different, which is exactly why it makes no sense to crown a winner based solely on how elaborate the decoration is or how often the object gets mentioned. One object helps us study the art and church culture of Clonmacnoise. The other literally preserves the names of people who lived and served at Lismore 9 centuries ago. There's also a strange contradiction in how well known each object actually is. The Lismore Crozier gets called the forgotten brother of the Clonmacnoise Crozier. Yet it also shows up on lists of Ireland's most important historical artifacts. Meanwhile, the Clonmacnoise Crozier itself sometimes gets far less attention in popular material. So, which one is actually the forgotten one? The answer depends less on historical value and more on which book, which exhibition, or which museum list happens to be open in front of you. In one context, the Lismore Crozier takes center stage because its origins are confirmed by an inscription. In another, the Clonmacnoise Crozier takes the spotlight thanks to its appearance, its find site, or its artistic execution.
But museum popularity is a poor measure of significance. An artifact doesn't become more important just because its photograph gets printed in more catalogs. And it doesn't become a copy just because it's easier for a museum guide to explain by comparing it to something more familiar. The Lismore Crozier tells the story of a monastery, of a craftsman named Nechtain, and of Bishop Niall. The Clonmacnoise Crozier is tied to a different religious center, a different environment, and its own chain of historical circumstances. Reducing both objects to a competition means losing half the information either one has to give us. That's exactly why the phrase "forgotten brother" sounds effective, but it's misleading. What we're looking at isn't a junior copy of a more famous masterpiece. It's an independent monument of medieval Ireland in its own right. The resemblance between them doesn't show dependence. It shows the sheer scale of an artistic culture capable of producing more than one work of this caliber. Historical fairness demands something simple here. Stop picking a single winner. The Derrynathlin chalice doesn't owe the Ardagh chalice a life lived in its shadow. And the Lismore Crozier doesn't owe the Clonmacnoise Crozier one either. Every one of these objects has its own name, its own story, and every right to be considered on its own terms. But if the Lismore Crozier is every bit the equal of its more famous brother, it makes it even harder to explain why, of the two, it's the one that spent 9 centuries behind a sealed door instead of on display. So why did a bishop even need a crozier? Was an influential head of the church really expected to walk around carrying an expensive stick covered in gold, silver, and glass? No. As a walking aid, an object like this would have been far too expensive, far too complex, and far too important. A bishop's crozier is a ceremonial mark of spiritual office. It shows that a person has been granted the right to lead a church community, to conduct the most important services, and to speak on behalf of the church across a defined territory. In the Middle Ages, a symbol of power like this needed no explanation. If you could recognize a king by his crown and a warrior by his weapon, then you could recognize a bishop by his mitre, his ring, and his crozier. These weren't random ornaments worn by a wealthy man. Each one told the people around him exactly what position he held and exactly what authority he carried. These are what's known as Episcopal regalia. Among them, the crozier held a special place because it was carried in the hand and displayed openly during public ceremonies. It was clearly visible in a procession. It rose above the crowd, and it physically marked the presence of church authority. Bring this back to Lismore. A mitre, a ring, and a crozier. Every single active bishop was expected to have all three. Which means, if the crozier vanished from use during its owner's lifetime,
Someone either took the regalia from a living man or was saving it after his death. But the crozier signaled more than just high status. Its shape echoed a shepherd's crook, and a bishop was symbolically understood as a shepherd, guiding his flock. Even someone who couldn't read understood the meaning. This wasn't just a wealthy clergyman standing before them. This was a leader, responsible for the people entrusted to him. And that's where the central contradiction sits. On one hand, the crozier spoke of care, guidance, and protection. On the other, the gold, the silver, the precious inlays, and the masterful craftsmanship turned it into a blunt statement of wealth and influence for the church center behind it. The Lismore Crozier shows this duality especially well. Its oak core followed the traditional shape of a shepherd's staff, but the metal covering, the filigree panels, the niello, and the glass eyes of the fantastical animals had nothing in common with a simple wooden stick from the countryside. What we're looking at is a carefully constructed image of power, disguised as a symbol of humble pastoral service. And this isn't unique to medieval Ireland. Episcopal and pastoral staffs, in various forms, are still used in the Catholic, Orthodox, and Anglican traditions today. You'll also find them among some Lutheran, Methodist, and other Christian communities that retain an Episcopal or similar system of church governance. The appearance and the rules of use differ, though. In the West, the most recognizable form is the curved crook resembling a shepherd's staff. In the Eastern Christian tradition, other forms are more common, including a head shaped like a cross, or two symmetrically curved figures, which is why calling the Lismore Crozier an ordinary walking stick completely misses its real meaning. It wasn't made for long walks, and it wasn't a wealthy bishop's personal indulgence. It was an official mark of office, a public symbol of influence, and, at the same time, a portable vessel for a venerated relic. Picture a ceremony at the start of the 12th century. A bishop walks in, and in his hand gleams a crozier covered in gold and silver plates, dark niello, and the eyes of fantastical creatures. Even someone who had never heard the man's name would understand immediately. Standing before them was someone backed by the full authority of Lismore Abbey. That's exactly why the disappearance of an object like this could never have gone unnoticed. The crozier didn't just represent one specific bishop. It represented the continuity of his office, the authority of the monastery, and the legitimacy of church leadership itself. Hiding it meant temporarily removing one of Lismore's principal symbols of power from public view. A bishop's crozier never existed in isolation. It was part of a full set of regalia that let people identify a church leader before his name was ever spoken. The mitre, the pectoral cross, the ring, and the crozier together formed a language of power that people of the Middle Ages understood without a word of written explanation. The mitre set a bishop apart from the rest of the clergy and marked his right to lead a solemn service. The pectoral cross was a reminder of the faith and the duties he took on along with his high office. The ring showed his bond with the church and with the community entrusted to his care. But the crozier was by far the most visible of these objects. The ring could only be seen up close. Robes partly hid the cross, but the tall curved staff rose above everyone in the procession. It functioned as a medieval mark of authority. If the crozier was in a bishop's hands, everyone around him knew exactly who was leading the ceremony. These weren't a personal jewelry collection. They were official marks of service. A bishop didn't put them on simply to look wealthy. The regalia were used in specific circumstances, and they underlined not just privilege, but obligation. The curved shape of the Western bishop's crozier echoed the outline of a shepherd's crook. That detail wasn't a craftsman's whim or a passing fashion. A bishop was seen as a shepherd, and the people entrusted to his spiritual guidance were seen as a flock, one that needed to be directed, protected, and brought back whenever it strayed off the dangerous path. The image sounds gentle, but in the Middle Ages it carried a real edge of power. A shepherd doesn't just care for the flock, he decides where it goes. So the crozier spoke all at once of protection, guidance, discipline, and the right to lead. In the Lismore Crozier, this symbolism was pushed to its limit. The simple shape of a shepherd's crook was wrapped in copper alloy sheeting, silver and gold elements, niello, glass, and figures of fantastical animals. A humble image of a rural shepherd was transformed into a luxurious church regalia, one whose sheer cost was itself proof of the monastery's power. This is where the crucial distinction between a symbol and an everyday object comes into focus. A real shepherd used his crook in his daily work. A bishop carried his ceremonial crozier during solemn occasions. One managed livestock in a pasture. The other, through that same recognizable image, made a statement about spiritual leadership over people. But a bishop couldn't freely use his crozier just anywhere. In Western church practice, it primarily signaled authority within his own diocese. There, the bishop was the lawful leader, and he used the regalia within the bounds of his own jurisdiction. If a ceremony took place within another diocese, the local bishop's permission was required. This rule made it clear the crozier wasn't marking some abstract honor, it marked a specific jurisdiction. Showing up with one without permission would have amounted to publicly claiming authority in a place where that authority belonged to someone else. That's exactly why the question of who actually held the Lismore Crozier mattered so much. It was made for Bishop Niall Mac Mic Aeducain and tied specifically to his service at Lismore. Outside that territory, the object kept its religious value, but its meaning as a mark of authority would have required a completely different ceremonial context. Together, these regalia turned the church hierarchy into something visible. The mitre showed rank. The ring showed a bond with the church. The cross showed a religious obligation. And the crozier showed the right to lead a community. Standing before people wasn't just a man in rich vestments, it was the holder of a precisely defined office. Which is why the Lismore Crozier can't be judged purely as a piece of jewelry craft. Its precious plates and glass eyes catch your attention, but its real meaning lay in who was permitted to pick it up in the first place. The luxury decorated the object. The right to use it turned that decoration into power. The use of a bishop's crozier followed a strict order. You couldn't just pick it up because it looked good next to church vestments. Every gesture, every moment it changed hands, even the position of the hands holding it, carried ceremonial meaning. If several bishops took part in the same service, only the one presiding over the ceremony would typically use the crozier. The others kept their rank, but they didn't display the right to lead that particular action. One crozier on display meant one person officially in charge of the rite. Behind this ceremonial logic sat a simple rule. A church service was a strictly organized event, and the regalia showed each participant's place within it. The crozier functioned almost like a badge, marking whoever was chairing an official gathering. The bishop held it in his left hand. The reason was both practical and symbolic. The right hand needed to stay free for blessings. The result was an image anyone could read at a glance, a mark of church authority in one hand, the bishop reaching out to the people with the other. During a procession, the crozier made it instantly possible to spot the bishop among the clergy. The tall, curved regalia was visible even to people standing far from the aisle. They might not see the ring or the pectoral cross, but a crozier raised above everyone else was impossible to miss. It was also used during the reading of the gospel. Its presence emphasized that the bishop wasn't taking part in the ceremony as an ordinary listener, but as the head of the church community entrusted to him. The object itself didn't replace the text, and it wasn't an object of worship. It simply marked the office of the person leading the rite. The same held true for preaching and for the solemn blessing. During an address to the people, the crozier was a reminder of a pastor's duty to guide and instruct. During the blessing itself, it stayed in the left hand, while the right hand performed the established gesture. The crozier could also appear during the taking of vows and other important ceremonies confirming religious obligations. Its presence heightened the official character of whatever was taking place. This wasn't a stage prop, it was a physical mark that whatever was happening under the authority of the church. None of these details would have meant anything if the crozier had simply been gathering dust in a storeroom, which tells us that before it ended up behind a sealed door in the castle, it had still been in active use in front of hundreds of people in Lismore's main church. But the bishop didn't hold the crozier constantly. Whenever a moment in the service required both hands free, the regalia was handed to a designated attendant, a server at the altar. That person had to receive the object, hold it in the proper position, and return it at exactly the right moment. In some ceremonial descriptions, attendants avoided touching the crozier with bare hands. Instead, a special cloth was used, protecting the regalia while also underlining its special status. The gesture made clear that what was being handed over wasn't an ordinary object, but an official, venerated mark of service. From the outside, these actions might look like trivial details. Why should it matter which hand holds the crozier, who receives it, or when it's handed back? But it was exactly these details that made up the ritual, and any deviation from them could easily read as disrespect toward the office, the territory, or the established hierarchy. The Lismore Crozier was built for exactly this kind of public use. Its gold and silver details were meant to catch the light as it moved. Its glass inlays were meant to sparkle. Its curved head was meant to stay visible above the crowd. The craftsmen who made it weren't designing for a motionless museum case. They were designing for ceremony, for procession, for a constantly shifting angle of view. That explains why the most heavily decorated sections cover exactly the most visible parts of the object. The crozier had to make an impression not just up close, but from a distance. Its appearance was meant to work together with the bishop's movements, his vestments, the lighting, and the overall solemnity of the rite. Today, when the Lismore Crozier sits behind museum glass, it's easy to see it as a static work of art. But 9 centuries ago, it existed in a completely different world. Raised during processions, handed to an attendant, returned to the bishop for a blessing. Its true purpose only revealed itself in motion. The shape of a bishop's crozier was designed like a sermon you could see. It was understood in 3 parts: a curved crook at the top, a straight shaft in the middle, and a pointed end at the bottom. Each part explained a different duty of spiritual leadership. The crook at the top was meant to bring back those who had strayed. Just as a shepherd hooks a lost sheep with his crook and steers it back to the flock, a bishop was expected to seek out people who had drifted away from the community. This wasn't about a physical act. It was about guidance, persuasion, and bringing people back to established order. But this metaphor wasn't as gentle as it might sound. The lost weren't simply to be pitied. They were to be turned around and led back. The curved crook symbolized the authority to intervene in someone else's choice, if that choice was seen as dangerous to the individual or to the community as a whole. That's the first part of the traditional formula. The crozier brings back those who've wandered too far. Under this reading, a bishop wasn't a passive observer. He was an active leader, one who couldn't simply stand by while his flock fell apart and lost its shared path. The pointed lower end carried an entirely different meaning. It was meant for people who hadn't gotten lost, but who simply refused to move. A shepherd might give a lagging animal a light push. A spiritual leader could give the hesitant and the idle a reminder of their obligations. Here, the language of medieval symbolism turns openly harsh. The crook brings back, the point drives forward. Care for the flock was understood not only as comfort, but as a demand for discipline. Still, the pointed end wasn't a license to use the crozier as a weapon. Its meaning was figurative.
A bishop was meant to move people to action through words, guidance, and personal example. The point was a reminder that spiritual authority isn't only about reassurance. It's also about pulling someone out of inaction. That's the second part of the symbolic construction. If the crook dealt with those who chose the wrong direction, the lower end addressed those who had simply stopped moving altogether. The medieval metaphor drew a distinction between two different problems and offered a different response for each. Between the crook and the point sat the straight shaft. It symbolized stability, faithfulness to the rules, and support for those still moving forward. A bishop was expected to support his community as reliably as a sturdy staff supports a traveler on a long road. It was the middle section that tied the two opposing actions together. At the top, bringing back the lost. At the bottom, pushing forward the ones who'd stalled. And in the middle, supporting those already moving in the right direction. Together, this formed an entire program for leading a community, contained inside a single object. This triple formula was clear even to someone who couldn't read. All it took was recognizing the familiar shape of a shepherd's staff and remembering how a flock is handled. The church had turned an ordinary rural tool into an image of spiritual leadership, discipline, and protection. In the Lismore Crozier, this simple metaphor received a lavish metal expression. The crook was wrapped in dense interlace, animal figures, and glass inlays. The oak core was hidden beneath plates of copper alloy, silver, and gold. A shepherd's symbol became a work of art, its cost alone announcing its owner's power. But the expensive materials never erased the original meaning of the shape. However elaborate the ornament, viewers still saw the crook, the shaft, and the point. Beneath all the jeweled luxury sat a stern message. Some people need to be brought back. Some need a push forward, and some just need something solid to lean on. That's how a bishop's crozier spoke, without a single word being said aloud. It promised protection to those who stayed within the community, guidance to those who'd strayed, and firmness toward those who refused their duties. Mercy, discipline, and authority, all folded into one object. A bishop's crozier wasn't something you bought as an expensive object or chose according to personal taste. It was handed over during a formal ceremony, at the moment a man took on the responsibilities of leading a church community. From that point on, the staff wasn't property for show. It was the visible mark of new authority and new obligations. A bishop received his crozier at his consecration. An abbot received one during the ceremony marking the start of his service. Before that moment, the man standing before the community was simply a spiritual figure who had been elected or appointed to a high office. After the regalia was handed over, he publicly took on responsibility for the people, the property, and the order of the religious center entrusted to him. This wasn't a nice gesture meant to dress up a formal occasion. Handing over the crozier confirmed that the new leader had the right to guide the community, preside over ceremonies, and represent church authority. The object gave that authority a physical form. For Bishop Niall, this ceremony wasn't abstract. In receiving the crozier, he publicly accepted responsibility for Lismore, and by extension, for protecting it, should the monastery ever come under threat. But along with that authority came a reminder of its limits. What was placed in his hands wasn't a victor's crown, and it wasn't a conqueror's weapon. It was a shepherd's staff. The very shape of the object made a statement. A leader's role wasn't to rise above his people, but to guide them, support them, and bring back those who had lost their way. At the ceremony, a special formula may have been recited. In it, the new bishop was called to accept the staff of pastoral service, to be strict when correcting wrongdoing, but never to let that strictness curdle into cruelty. Judgment was to be delivered without anger, and people were to be guided not only through punishment, but through the encouragement of virtue. And that's where church authority's central contradiction sits. A leader had to be stern, yet merciful, demanding, yet fair, composed, yet never indifferent. A pastor who was too soft lost control of his flock. One who was too harsh destroyed the very community entrusted to him.
The formula of investiture demanded that this delicate balance be maintained. The bishop was reminded that anger must never dictate his decisions. Even when correcting wrongdoing, he was expected to think not of personal offense, but of restoring someone to the established order. At the same time, he was warned against the opposite extreme. In calm times, the rules couldn't simply be relaxed just because an immediate danger had passed. Discipline wasn't considered necessary only during crisis. It was considered necessary even when everything looked fine on the surface. So, a short ceremonial speech became something closer to an instruction manual for leadership. There was no promise of unlimited freedom for the new leader here. On the contrary, every power granted came with a demand to answer for the consequences of one's own decisions.
The Lismore Crozier was meant to take part in exactly this kind of framework. It may have been commissioned by Bishop Niall Mac Mic Aeducain as a mark of an office he already held, or as a regalia tied specifically to his service at Lismore. The inscription secured the patron's name, but the object itself proclaimed his office far louder than any words could. The choice of materials was no accident either. Oak gave it a sturdy core. Precious metals underlined its owner's high status, and the reliquary tied its owner's authority to something sacred. The crozier fused administrative power, religious symbolism, and the work of the finest craftsmen of its time into a single object. In receiving a staff like this, a bishop was accepting an object meant to outlive his own tenure. The crozier could pass to the monastery, be kept as a relic, and stand as a reminder of a previous leader. That's exactly why Niall's name has stayed tied to Lismore for more than 900 years. But the solemn formula also carried a warning. Power is easy to display through gold, a tall mitre, and a lavishly decorated crozier. It's far harder to fulfill the demand that came with it, to correct without rage, to judge without personal vengeance, and to hold onto firmness without losing mercy. That was the real meaning of the ceremony. The crozier gave a man the right to lead others, while reminding him at the same time that he himself was bound by the rules of service. The richer and more visible the regalia, the more publicly accountable its holder became. The Western bishop's crozier, with its curved crook, is far from the only form the pastoral staff has taken. In the Eastern Christian tradition, a different version emerged, one that a modern viewer might find almost startling. Instead of the familiar shepherd's crook, its top featured a crossbar, a cross, or two curved serpents. One of the earliest forms echoed the Greek letter tau, a simple crossbar joined to a vertical shaft, resembling the letter T. This construction kept its connection to the cross, but looked noticeably different from the coiled headpiece familiar from Western images of bishops. Later, the ends of the crossbar began to curve upward. Over time, they turned into two symmetrical figures, resembling serpents, facing one another. Between them, a small cross was often placed, becoming the focal point of the whole composition. This symbolism is easy to misread. Today, the image of a serpent is often understood purely as a sign of deceit, danger, or evil. But in biblical texts, the image is far more layered and directly tied to the staffs of Moses and Aaron. The 4th chapter of the book of Exodus tells how Moses' staff was miraculously turned into a serpent. Moses recoiled from it, but then, at God's command, he grabbed the serpent by the tail, and it became a staff again. That episode, told in verses 2 through 4, becomes a mark of authority granted from above. An even more charged scene appears in the 7th chapter of Exodus, in verses 10 through 12.
Aaron throws down his staff before Pharaoh, and it turns into a serpent. Egypt's sorcerers repeat the miracle, but Aaron's staff swallows theirs whole.
This isn't decorative folklore. It's a demonstration of authority. In the biblical account, a staff confirms that its holder is acting on behalf of something greater than himself. The object becomes a mark of a mission, of a test, and of authority that even a resisting ruler is forced to recognize. So the two serpents on an Eastern pastoral staff don't necessarily signal threat or the worship of some dangerous creature. They're a reference to the biblical staffs that changed shape, only to become marks of leadership once again. The cross, placed between them, makes clear exactly whose authority they answer to, in Christian interpretation. The Byzantine version looks nothing like the Irish Lismore Crozier. There's no single large crook curving downward here, no visual shorthand for gathering back the lost. Instead, the head is built around the balance of two symmetrical figures and a central cross. But the difference in form doesn't change the shared purpose. Both the Western crook and the Eastern crossbar with its serpents announce the same thing. Standing before the people is the leader of a church community. Both objects turn invisible authority into a sign you can see from a distance. These are two different artistic languages of the Christian world. Irish craftsmen decorated their crozier with interlace, precious plates, and fantastical animals with glass eyes. Eastern craftsmen used strict symmetry, the image of the cross, and the biblical scene of a staff transforming into a serpent. At first glance, an enormous distance separates these two traditions, but both reach for the same idea. A pastor receives the right to lead a community and, at the same time, accepts the responsibility of answering for it. A crozier shows power, but it never lets you forget exactly why that power was granted. And this brings us right back to the Lismore Crozier. Its head doesn't echo the Byzantine composition of two serpents, but it's covered in interlaced creatures, jaws open, glass eyes glinting. Lismore spoke this same language of power in its own way. Animal imagery surrounds this symbol of church authority too, turning an ordinary staff into a dense religious message. 9 centuries ago, these signs were understood far more clearly than they are today. People didn't just see gold, silver, and fantastical beasts. They saw confirmation of the Bishop of Lismore's authority. The crozier spoke all at once of the right to lead, the duty to protect, and the need to hold a community together against collapse. And then this loud symbol of power was silenced. It was removed from ceremony, hidden alongside an ancient book, and sealed behind a door that was gradually buried under discarded junk. The name of the person who did it disappeared, but the crozier survived. When workers opened that forgotten passage in 1814, they didn't just recover a richly decorated relic. They uncovered an object that combined the authority of a medieval bishop, the signature of a craftsman named Nechtain, the memory of Lismore Abbey, and the symbolism of an ancient church tradition. Behind one door, for nearly 9 centuries, a story waited. One its creators recorded not on paper, but in oak, bronze, silver, gold, and glass. If you've stayed with me this long, it means you, like us, care less about what the guidebooks say and more about what's being hidden behind closed doors. If the story of the Lismore Crozier has shown you just how many secrets old castle walls can hide, back this video with a like. Tell me in the comments, do you think this discovery was pure chance? Or was there a deliberately built hiding place waiting behind that sealed door? Subscribe to the channel and make sure you turn on notifications so you don't miss the next investigation into ancient artifacts, forgotten discoveries, and chapters of history that still raise uncomfortable questions. This channel exists for exactly those people. There are plenty more discoveries ahead of us, the kind that can change the way you look at the past for good.